So, hi everyone and welcome. This is the Lead First podcast, and on the call are two people, my colleague Sandhya Sridhar, and also an expert in the history of Dravidianism in Tamil Nadu. He's from Chennai, and therefore he does not exactly want to be, he doesn't want his name to be disclosed for obvious reasons. So, let's get the conversation started. So, I'm going to ask you, sir, can you take us, let's get to the basics first. So can you take us through the history of the whole Dravidian movement, starting from well before Periyar, in fact, from the Justice Party and before that? Could you take us, run us very briefly through that?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. And let me just walk through the history itself very quickly. So if we were to look at the period where the Dravidian core ideological movement started in real earnest and to where it is today, we can probably break it out into following segments. From the beginnings in 1911, when the South India Liberal Foundation was formed, and then which morphed into a political party. It was still the South India Liberal Federation, but it was called the Justice Party because they had a magazine called Justice, which they were publishing. And from that period onwards, they actually ran the government for 15 years or so. And in between, there were interludes where different factions of the Congress, the Swaraj Party, also held a position in government. And then it moved into 1930s, the mid-30s onwards, when the movement started declining in influence, mainly because the main Congress, the Indian National Congress, after 1935, entered the fray for provincial governments in the electoral fray for provincial governments, and they formed the provincial government from 1937 to 39. And then the Second World War intervened. And during this period, the original people who formed the Justice Party had grown old, and the movement itself, because of certain factors, because of the waning influence of the old moneyed landlords and the ICS elite, and the increasing influence of the Indian National Congress, which by now had become the mass movement across all of India for the freedom movement because of its increased popularity and influence among the common people, the Justice Party and the South Indian Liberal Federation's influence declined. And between then, in the war period, in the World War II period, leading up to the formation of 1949, when the DMK was itself formed, was probably the second phase of the Dravidian movement. And this is when it is during this period that E.V. Ramaswamy was emerged as the real leader of the Dravidian movement in this period from roughly around 1935 till 1949. 1949 was a landmark period in which C.N. Annadurai decided that he wants to join the mainstream of politics in India, not necessarily as a separatist, but as through constitutional means and by participating in the constitutional and the political process, the democratic political process. 1949 to 1967 is probably the third phase in the Dravidian movement, when the DMK was a rising opposition and the Congress party, as in the rest of India, the Indian National Congress was at the pole position in political power, and the DMK was the contender up until 1967, when Annadurai actually captured power. So 1967 till 1976 was the fourth phase, when this was the very first taste of the Dravidian movements or the mass movement. The Dravidian movement had taken form as a mass political movement, a popular movement, had an electoral machine, and had wide support from wide swaths of the population, and they were also in government in 1967 to 1976. Then emergency intervened, and from 1977 to 1987 or 1989, roughly 1989, we could take it as the period of MGR and Karunanidhi as the two opposing poles in Tamil Nadu politics. And, intermediate after MGR's demise in 1987, there was an period of confusion, back and forth when power was split between different factions of the AIDMK. And for a short period of power, Karunanidhi held power for from 1989 to 1991, which was a short period of power. So we can take the whole events in the period between 1977 to 1991 as the fifth period of Dravidian politics. And then the final period would be the Jayalalitha Karunanidhi era, 1991 to 2016, when the whole of politics in Tamil Nadu was bipolar between the two poles, political poles of Jayalalitha and the towering personalities of Jayalalitha and Karunanidhi. So this is how we can take the history of the movement, and the characteristic of the movement changed in each period. So if we take the early period, when the Justice Party or the South Indian Liberal Federation was formed, it was essentially a movement by the landed elite, mostly the landed elite, ICS elite, and the legal elite. And they had triggering process for the genesis of the Dravidian movement of the Justice Party was the introduction of diarchy. When instead of people being nominated, Indians being nominated to positions in government by the Viceroy or by the Governor General or the Governor of Madras Presidency, they would actually have to face elections. These were not elections at that time, were not the elections as we imagine it, which was through universal suffrage. But there was an election where there was an element of universal suffrage because all taxpayers would vote. And then there were different constituencies for professionals, different constituency for legal people, different constituency for zamindars, and so on and so forth. But still, there was an element that you actually had to go out, make yourself popular, and win. And in this period, during this period, it was probably at this point in time that the dichotomy between Brahmin and non-Brahmin elites formed in Madras Presidency.
You've come to a very important point, because this is an issue that has been a cornerstone of the Dravidian movement, this whole anti-Brahmin movement. And of late, we've also been watching on social media how there's been a pushback in terms of Brahmins who are now a little more vocal. They're many generations away, and they're now pushing back, saying, "Don't abuse us using our caste." So I'll let you continue, because this is very interesting.
Yeah, this is the genesis basically was not only in Madras Presidency, but over a period of time. See, the kind of structure that the East India Company had entered India during the time of the Mughal emperors itself, and had been increasing its influence. But the East India Company's influence and the takeover by the Crown made a big difference, in that after the Crown took over, a formal bureaucracy, which was a government and led by a governor and a cabinet and people in the bureaucracy and in the police, was actually formed. And it was a drastic departure from the time when the East India Company was trying to establish its government or establish its power in the Indian subcontinent, to when they were the establishment. The British Crown was the establishment. And, the lot of the native forms of government, native forms of capital accumulation had all been disrupted drastically. So before the 19th century was a period of immense change, in that, if you look at the Marxist historians like Irfan Habib or Dharma Kumar, they have documented, and from the records, they have documented that land as a source of power and wealth increased dramatically in importance during this period of the 19th century. And capital accumulation and capital formation took on the contours of a traditional feudal economy, mainly during this period, because the system in India was less oriented towards the feudal system in Europe, and it was more of the small self-contained village republics, as Marx called them. And the political economy had changed such that native systems of education had broken down. There wasn't enough scope for native artisans and people in the crafts. De-urbanization again is a documented factor of the 19th century because a lot of the urban centers, which were sources of industry and commerce, had started to diminish in population itself. They were depopulated. Many urban centers, especially in North India, in the Gangetic Plain, were depopulated, and the artisans and so on lost their importance in the scheme of things. Among these were also people like the Odwars in temples, the temple priests, all these service castes, so to speak. The temple priests, the Odwars, the dancers, the Devadasis, all these people lost their economic importance and were fairly reduced to, subsistence level existence. And the other
what
thing
was
that
the reason for this?
one of the big reasons was that, see, the self-sustaining system in the villages was predicated upon the sources of irrigation, the sources of capital accumulation, and the sources of local governance, basically policing, all being done at the local level. Now, the crown took over in the early phases itself after the East India Company started doing it, and then the crown accelerated the process. And because of this, the local self-governance structures were broken down and everything became centralized, and there was a need of a bureaucracy. So once you have this bureaucracy and the local economy is broken, then the huge transfer of wealth from the Indian countryside out of India into Europe was accelerated again during the 19th century. So if you read a historian like Davies, was documented all these famines and the plague in the 19th century in late Victorian Holocaust. The book called Late Victorian Holocaust, in which he documents that use of technology like railways and so on actually helped to spread famine through the land. And people were selling their land for a song, and certain communities benefited vastly from this phenomenon. Some of the earlier landlords and the people who were given zamindari rights benefited hugely from this phenomenon, in which they could lend money and then become landlords through lending money. For example, the zamindar of Devakotai had lent money to the Raja of Ramnad in the 19th century. He had lent them money which the Raja of Ramnad could not repay, and therefore he had taken over land in lieu of his repayments and had himself declared the Zamindar of Devakotai, and the Zamindar of Andipati again were all zamins created through this process. And if you remember, the system of local governance rolled up into the system of the Palakarans. And again, the Palekaran system, if you look at the East India Company's history between 1750 to 1801, in those 50 years, all the Palakarans, Samasthanams had been destroyed. Their systems of production, governance were all disrupted drastically, right? So because of which money, both money, capital, accumulated in the hands of a few people, land accumulated in the hands of a few people, and now that left the bureaucracy. And there, what happened was, there is the tradition before the British Crown actually took over governance in Madras Presidency. During the time of the East India Company, the bureaucracy and the police were fairly distributed, and they utilized a lot of the traditional systems. So a lot of the dubashas and the agents of the company were used to be from the traditional merchant classes. So, for example, the agent of Arbuthnot and Co. Was Sir Pitti Tyagaraya Chetty, and even earlier during the British period, you will find the name of a gentleman called Casse Verona. So when I looked back at the records, I found that it is actually Kasi Veerana Chetty from Payavarkade, who was from a cloth and salt trading community, and he had come and taken up residence as an agent of the company, and he had made a lot of wealth from the community, from the company. And then what happened was, these people transferred their allegiance to the crown as tax harvesters, as tax collectors. The zamindari was essentially a form of tax collection, where the Zameen could manage the lands in his possession, in his domain as he wished, collect a portion of the taxes, manumit it to the crown, pay it to the crown, and keep what he could for himself. So essentially, these were tax farmers. So now bureaucracy was needed. So once the local self-governance was broken, you needed a central constabulary and a central bureaucracy to manage this. And once you needed a central bureaucracy and a constabulary to manage it, you need people from the traditional castes which were reading and writing to come and man those jobs. And then the East India Company used to take people who were from the usual castes which actually were in charge of village self-governance. So if you look at many of the dubashas and the clerks of the company, they used to be in the south, they used to be very often Saivapillays, and in the north, they very often used to be Mudalayars. For example, like Pachepa Mudalayar was a philanthropist, and he was one of the dubashas of the company. Now that system was replaced by the crown in a replica of what they had in Whitehall, which was selection through interviews and competitive procedures. Now what happened was, you had the old bureaucracy, and which was partly a bureaucracy and partly a landowning elite, which ran the affairs of the company somewhat as agents of the company, versus government employees. Now, the first set of people who joined these professions as government employees were from the Brahmin communities, middle Brahmin communities, typically the Vaidika communities who had lost their source of income because the local economies in the villages were were not doing well, and they had kept up with their tradition of reading and writing and so on, because these castes used to used to spend more time in studies, whereas artisan castes would usually just in the village patasala, the artisan caste would learn a little bit of learning, reading, writing, some mathematics, the basic enough amount to learn their craft, and then move on to actually taking care of their craft. Vast agricultural communities, each of which farmed a portion of the village land and also had a bit of land for themselves. So for them, the business of learning to read and write was, if it was enough, they learned the basics of reading and writing from the village patasala, and then they would go on to their profession. Now these people were definitely disadvantaged, and the Brahmins were the first to get their foot in the door of the British administration. So the very first numbers which we get for this is from 1870. One table I saw in Tanjavur district. It was for the number of the respective castes of people who were clerks and sharistadars and such middle level government jobs, and it was 70% of them were Maharashtrian Brahmins, specifically Deshastha Brahmins, who were there and who were already involved in governance of the Tanjavur Samasthanam, because these people had traveled with the Maratha rulers of Tanjavur, and they were part of the Samasthanam as hereditary servitors of the Tanjavur Samasthanam as clerks and officials and so on. And these people quickly transitioned, and following their lead, Telugu Brahmins and Tamil Brahmins also started entering the bureaucracy in very large numbers. So the table for 1911 shows roughly around 5,000, 6,000 positions in Madras Presidency for clerical posts, lower and higher clerical posts, and district munsif, district sub-magistrate, and sharistadar, these kind of positions where the Brahmin bureaucracy dominated. If you look at where they really dominated, it was in a lot of the clerical posts, and the traditional Mudalayar, Naidu, and the Saivapillai elite, many of whom had also become rich landlords. But then they found that in this period, when this crown-based, when the system of exams and interviews had come in, they found that the Brahmins in these last 50-odd years had stolen a march over them. And because of this foot in the door in government clerical positions or bureaucratic positions, these people, their next generations had the, if your father was a clerk, a young man whose father was a clerk in the government would always have the ability and the background to be able to study to become a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer or take up the professions. And the professions were opened up in a big way only in the late 19th century to Indians. Before that, Indians did not have much access to the professions, because if you read the history of the Madras High Court, you would know that the early lawyers, the great lawyers about whom many stories are spoken, are people like Grant, Norton. There are still streets in Mylapore called Norton Street. which was named after a very famous lawyer called Norton. And till the early 20th century, no Indian could ever aspire to become a judge of the High Court. And the first Indian to become a judge of the High Court was Justice Muthuswami Iyer. And the story goes that he studied by streetlight as a young man and studied and made it work very hard and made it up in life to become a judge of the High Court.
So you're basically saying that it's only towards, say, the late 1800s that Indians, whether Brahmins or any other caste, had access to education and to these very, what we now look at as prestigious professions.
That is correct. See, I was reading, there is a Dr. Narendran who has written a very good book called Kalani Adikathil Namvalvum Nalavalvum. So it's a very interesting book. It's in Tamil. He has chronicled the history of medicine in Madras Presidency, right from the time when Madras Medical College was first started. So the whole idea, the Madras Medical College and the medical colleges in Calcutta, Madras and Bombay were started mainly to cater to the expatriate British population. And then in the 18th century, when communicable diseases became such a huge problem, that's when they expanded the college to actually admit Indian students in the mid 1870s onwards. So before that, all medicine was caste-based. You had people called Marutuvar, communities called, in Maharashtra they are called Vaidyas, in Tamil Nadu they are called Marutuvar, in Andhra they are called Mangli. And these communities used to perform the role of the medicine man. In South Tamil Nadu, they are called Valluvars also. And one group of them are today in the scheduled caste. But Brahmins started taking up this profession because they saw that it was an opportunity for entering the services or entering professional services. And it was an opportunity. So they entered this profession as lawyers and as doctors in the 1870s onwards, 1880s onwards only. And if you take the ICS was not actually open to Indians till the late 1880s. And it's only after that Indians started clearing the ICS. And then again, in the ICS, it was a much more mixed group, because to clear the ICS, you often had to go and study and take tuition and study in London. So it was very few people who could actually manage that. And there in the ICS, it was a much more mixed bag. I mean, all of them elite castes, but not exclusively Brahmins.
So we were talking about different kinds of, the benefits that the different communities had. So we had the Saiva Pillai and the others aggregating land and wealth. And you had the Brahmins who had already had a foot in the door of education, who went in for clerical and knowledge-based jobs, if we can call them that. So my query is very simple, and it's a question because I'm curious as well. So where did this anti-Brahmin narrative even start, and how did it become so popular, and how was it generated into an umbrella hatred for the Brahmin community as such?
See, the initial days, the Dravidian, the early people in the Dravidian movement, most of them were not, anti-Brahmin as such. They just resented dominance of Brahmins in the professions, and they resented the rise of Brahmins. Typically, if you were, a rural Mudlayar landlord, and you had to come to the city, you had to seek out the services of a Brahmin, whom you would not see as your social equal in the village, right? But in the city, you would have to deal with the person as an equal, and it would probably make them uncomfortable, for one thing. And it was also a question of, by this time, by the 1911, by the time diarchy came through, Brahmins were in two positions. They were both in established positions inside the bureaucracy and in the professions. They were also outside as part of the freedom movement. There were a lot of Brahmins in the freedom movement. Annie Besant's Irish, the Indian Home Rule League, of which Annie Besant established, had a lot of Brahmins in it. The newspaper editors were very often, critical of the British government, of the colonial government, were also Brahmins, right? So the British government, the Crown and the colonial establishment, as well as the Christian establishment, felt that it was not proper, or it was not in their interest to have such a group which was in position both on their side as well as on their opposing side, and you needed a countervailing force. So, which is why the Brahmin anti-Brahmin narrative was set at this time, because it suited the British colonial government, it suited the missionaries who were trying to proselytize, and it also suited the crown loyalists. Most of these, most of the South Indian Liberation Federation people, for Liberal Federation people, were loyalists to the crown. So it suited them to make it a race thing.
So number one is, when you said that a rural zamindar who's coming into the city and needs to get work done has to interact with a Brahmin who's not necessarily his social equal in a village. Could you expand on that, A? And B, are you saying that the British were also in on this whole narrative setting of the anti-Brahmin?
Very much so, very much so. So let me first, I'll tell you why in the village setting, a traditional village setting, the Brahmin would not be the social equal. I mean, the Brahmin would definitely not be the economic equal of the Zamindar to start with. The Brahmin would have higher position in the ritual hierarchy, right? But in terms of social hierarchy, the Brahmin was a service provider, and the Mudaliar or the landlord was the pole around which the village operated, right? So he held the land, and the land was a source of income. The land was a primary source of power, of income, of sustenance for the entire village, and he held the biggest lot of land, and therefore he was the most powerful man in the village. Plus, you must also remember that the Mudaliars, Naidus, Naikars very often were also the Dharmakartas, and also even the Natkote Chettiars. They were the Dharmakartas and the patrons of the local temple also, whichever was the biggest temple in town. And therefore, much of the operations, see, if you look at the Patashalas, Veda Patashalas which operated during that time, they were either called Chetti Patashalas or Pillai Patashalas, because it was only the Chettiars, rich Chettiars and the Pillais who could fund the Patashalas, Veda Patashalas. The Brahmin whose life revolved around the Veda Patashala and as a Vaidika and revolved around it was dependent on these people for his sustenance. The Brahmin families linked to the temple were dependent on the temple for sustenance, and the Dharmakarta was one of the primary decision makers in the temple, right? The Dharmakarta of the temple. And then if you had the other Brahmins who were eking out some small village karanam or some jobs like that, they were again, these were typical the middle class in the village. A very tiny middle class existed in the village of village karanams and local officials, so on, which were either sometimes Brahmins, sometimes Pillais or Velalars, sometimes Mudaliar, sometimes Naidu. And in the south, there were also a lot of Saiva Pillais who were in these positions. So if you look at them, they would not really be the social equal of the Zamindar. Even if the Zamindar was a Mudaliar or the Zamindar was a Maravar and the Saiva Pillai was the Karanam, the Saiva Pillai was higher in ritual hierarchy than the Maravar, right? In those terms. But the Saiva Pillai in social terms was not the equivalent of the Maravar landlord. So whoever was the landlord was sat at the top of the social pole. And when you came to Madras and or you came to Madurai or you came to Coimbatore for certain legal work or something, you have to go to a lawyer's office, or you had to go and seek out a sub-magistrate, or you had to seek out a government office where the guy signing authority would be a British ICS officer, but the guy actually ensuring that your stuff was done was some clerk, was a Brahmin clerk. In the village, the guy would have been hardly a social equal, but you were dependent on him and you were subservient to him in the setting of the government office or the court. I hope that explains where these people came from.
That's an extraordinary thing, because honestly, I think where Sandhya's, my colleague's question comes from is the fact that Brahmins have been portrayed for a long time as big landowners, as zamindars, as very powerful people, both in the caste hierarchy as well as in the social hierarchy. But what you're saying is pretty different.
See, there were zamindars. See, if you look at Brahmin zamindars, for example, if you take the Bhumimhars in northeastern Gangetic belt in Bihar and eastern UP, Bhumihars. Or if you take the Brahmins, many of the Brahmin families in Tanjavur or the Delta district, Delta portion of Tamil Nadu, or Brahmins in Godavari, even though they were theoretically Vaidiki, but their, the kind of lifestyle, maybe not lifestyle, but the kind of position they held and their political preferences and so on often mirror that of any other dominant caste. Right? If you take the Bhumihar, their behavior, their political preferences, the way they mobilize politically, it doesn't differ from any other dominant caste.
Is there a reason why the Brahmin Savakasts have not mobilized politically and used their community as political capital? And why is that? Historically, it's been a very silent community.
It is only in recent terms that the community has been very silent. But if you look at political mobilization right from the time of the Maratha Sardars, even though the Chhatrapati or the Maratha king was the titular head, the primus inter pares or first among equals was always the Peshwa in Pune, or for that matter, many of the Nizams of Hyderabad and the Sultans of Bijapur, and many of them had Deshastha Brahmins as their bureaucrats. And again in Madras Presidency, that tradition continued through into Bombay Presidency and Madras Presidency, where many of the leaders in the Congress, if you take M.G. Ranade, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Tilak, or in Tamil Nadu, if you take the older generation, Satyamurthy Iyer, Srinivas Iyengar, a lot of the leaders of the Congress, a lot of them were Brahmins, and they were fairly, it was a very politically, politically aware community all over India. So the idea that Brahmins are apolitical or do not mobilize is something of fairly recent origin, and it has been internalized by the community, especially among the Tambram community.
So speaking specifically about the Tamil Brahmins, you were talking about how the British were in on building this narrative along with and it suited the Justice Party that there should be a sort of an anti-Brahmin movement. Can you elaborate on that?
There was a need felt to curtail the participation of Brahmins in government services. This was not felt just in Madras Presidency. The other place, one of the earliest places where reservation was brought was both in Mysore state and in Kolhapur state. In Mysore state, again, it was felt that Brahmins formed too much of the bureaucracy, and in Kolhapur, the reservation was 50% and 50%. So the reservation was 50% for Brahmins and 50% for anybody except Brahmins. So the very idea of reservation in Kolhapur state was a negative discrimination. It was basically to cap the participation of Brahmins in the bureaucracy at a particular level, at 50%. So that was the extent to which it was dominant. So in Mysore also, the same need was felt to cap the participation of Brahmins. And what happened in Madras Presidency was just a continuation of the same two policies in Kolhapur state and in Mysore. The need was felt that you should cap the participation of Brahmins, but there was no real feeling that the Brahmins had to be taken out of their ritual roles, except maybe in Kolhapur state, where Shahuji Maharaj, because of certain very personal reasons, he wanted to, replace Brahmins in their ritual roles. But let's leave that out and focus on Madras Presidency. See, the earlier, before, the anti-Brahmin sentiment had been a part of the colonial experience, both the Islamic colonial as well as the British and French colonial experience, where in the early stages of the missionary movement, the Jesuits came and tried to co-opt the Brahmins. In fact, some of the first converts that they tried to adopt were Brahmins, because they felt that these were the religious leaders of the community, and if they converted the Brahmins would automatically convert quite a few of the other communities also. And the same tactic was, strategy was adopted in the early stages of the East India Company. So the Christian technique was to initially try and convert the Brahmins, but then that didn't do so well because they didn't, the rest of the people didn't really follow suit when the Brahmins converted. So the other alternative was to then you basically demonize somebody, and say that this community is responsible for all of the evils of the pagans, and therefore if you remove them, then the people will step into the light, which is a typical Christian kind of Christian evangelical tactic, for spreading their ideas and so on. And if you look at the initial ethnographic studies, for example, people like Abbé Dubois. Abbé Dubois was a French Catholic missionary who traveled around South India, and one of the earliest ethnographic studies of South India was produced by Abbé Dubois. And he had actually a lot of the language which is used about Brahmins, that they are cunning, that they are cruel, that they are manipulative, and they dominate everybody else. All of that comes from the atrocity literature produced by the missionaries, right? I'm not saying that, it is all the missionaries and everybody else is innocent in the whole thing, but the tools, techniques, the themes, narrative building was taken from the missionaries and Jesuits, but the hate is entirely, homegrown hate.
Okay, this is very interesting. So the Brahmins sort of became the witches in a sense. So well, they were not exactly burnt at the stake, but a lot of bad blood did develop post that. So how did this culminate in the whole Dravidian movement? Where did the Dravidam come in here? How did that work?
See, the source is probably the Caldwell and G.U. Pope, who wrote a comparative study on linguistics, in which he postulated, Caldwell and Pope, they postulated these various things. They were Scottish missionaries. So these Protestant missionaries, basically, they they promulgated, they came up with the idea that G.U. Pope came up with the idea or the concept that there must be a Dravidian family of languages as opposed to the Aryan or Indo-European family of languages. Remember, in the early days, in the times of William Jones onwards during the East India Company, there was the Indological studies were very appreciative of Sanskrit literature and of the Vedic corpus, in that they said this was high culture, and this belongs to the Nordic races, and the Brahmins and other races in India are actually Nordic races who were mixed with the lower races and became debased, but they have maintained the old Indo-European culture and the language, the noble language, and so on, right? That was the early phase of the colonial movement and colonial Indological study. But in the later phase of Indological study, what happened was, after G.U. Pope identified the Dravidian family of languages, Caldwell, he tried, preaching among the among the Shanar community in Tirunelveli, and there again he came up with this theory that there was a nativist religion, okay, which was based on ancestor worship and worship of spirits and nature and so on, which was superseded by a invading religion, which was the high Hindu religion. Okay, if you look at traditional practice of religion, there is no real discrimination behind these two. You would have a Pandaram non-Brahmin priest in your Kuladeva temple, and a Brahmin will go and worship there, and a non-Brahmin will go and worship in a Shiva temple where there will be a Brahmin priest. But this idea of two different religions, two different language families was gained currency. And then you must also remember that the 1880s was a period when there were a lot of pseudoscientific fields of study like eugenics and study of skull shapes, in which based on the skull shape and the shape of the nose and the skin color, you would assign a race or a mixture of races to human beings, and human beings were supposed to have different kind of characteristics based on which race they belong to. Right? This one, and this same study of eugenics was also what inspired the fascist and the Nazi movement in Europe, and this same eugenics was something that was also inspired the later post Justice Party people. I mean, there was a thread which was taken from the missionaries, and picked up by some of the Justice Party leaders and some, Tamil nationalist movement leaders like, Maraimalai Adigal, Devanaya Pavanar. All these people also adopted and internalized many of these theories. These theories, they were pretty much in currency in a large part of Europe and America till the 1920s, till the 1920s. And what theories, the same Aryan Dravidian theory, again got a fresh boost of life when the ruins at Mohenjo-daro were discovered, when it was found that there was an ancient civilization. And so, at that time, the time of the Rig Veda had already been fixed at 1500 BC, and they found, artifacts from, a very, very ancient past. And Mortimer Wheeler, the person who was supposed to have done the dig at Mohenjo-daro, picked up a verse from the Rig Veda which said that Indra had destroyed Pura, destroyed cities, and said that Indra stands accused of destroying the Mohenjo-daro Indus, of destroying the Mohenjo-daro Indus Valley civilization. Right. So all of these, theories and half-baked, untested theories came together and then formed fertile ground in the minds of the Dravidian intellectuals of the 1920s and the 1930s, which is where we take off from the period of the Justice Party and step into the next period, in which these race theories found a lot of currency among the Dravidian intellectuals. And during this period, the Congress had again gained the upper hand in politics, and they were the leading, political formation. And even at that time, there were many of the leaders of the Madras Congress, where people like Srinivas Iyengar, Rajagopalachari. Rajagopalachari had made his mark on the stage by then. There were, Satyamurthy Iyer. And before that, the revolutionary faction was people like Vavesu Iyer, Nilakanta Brahmachari, and Vanchinathan. A lot of these people were Brahmins in the freedom movement, and they had, and other people also. There were so many people. I mean, you cannot neglect the contribution of so many other people. Tirupur Kumaran, Vavu Chidambaram Pillai, and Ardhanarishwara Varma. So many of these freedom fighters, it had become a mass popular movement, and the South Indian Liberal Federations, and especially the people from the Justice Party, were definitely looking very old-fashioned. So that's that. In that situation, what happened was eventually the South Indian Liberal Federation and the Justice Party was folded into the self-respect movement, and many of the older people handed over the baton to a very ambitious and very aggressive young politician called E.V. Ramaswamy. So this period is probably when E.V. Ramaswamy was really held center stage in the Dravidian movement. Though the Dravidian movement was largely a sideshow, because the main pole of politics was the Congress and the freedom movement. But these people continued in the self-respect movement, and during that time, since power, the provincial power had been handed over till 1939, provincial power was in the hand of the Congress, and during the war years, there was a lot of hardship that people faced, and during that time, E.V. Ramaswamy, because of the fact that he was from a landholding family, plus the fact that a lot of the older landholding leaders, political leaders, had waned and left the limelight. He, because of the way his ability to, his ability to make very rousing speeches, write very, his style of writing was such that it was a very crude way of writing, very crude way of communication, but it hit home, and he gathered around him a lot of very young people, say Nedinjali and Annadurai, and all these other people who became very, who also had this skill with letters and who were from the middle class. And these people stayed with him through 1949. So during this period, the Dravidian movement was largely anti-establishment, And it is when their anti-Brahmin and the race theory really hardened into the core of the Dravidian philosophy or the Dravidian ideology. So you could look at this as the a very crucial period when the ideology really hardened and found full form in terms of what it meant to future generations.
I have a question here. I'm finding it very interesting that this movement has consolidated and crystallized very strongly in only the linguistic region that is now known as Tamil Nadu. We must remember at the time of Periyar, Anna, and I mean before their time, I mean it was the Madras presidency, and the linguistic boundaries had not yet so firmly crystallized. So how did it come about that the other neighboring South Indian states were not so co-opted into this Dravidian race theory?
See, the early players in the Justice Party were people like T.M. Nair, who was a leading person from, he was a very leading doctor and also from a very aristocratic Nair family in Malabar. A lot of coastal Andhra Pradesh, all the way up to the northern Sarkars in southern Odisha, Barhampur, all the way up to Barhampur, were in the hands of a lot of the zamindaris. So the Justice Party leaders were often zamindars of Madras presidency. And therefore, there was a lot of participation of Telugu communities. And even Sir Patro was Odia. He was a Odia Kandayat. He was also one of the leading members of the Justice Party. Many of the Jamindars in the south were also associated with the Justice Party. But the core of the movement, shifted. The intellectual core or the ideological core had always been the combination of Saiva Pillai, Natukottai Nagarthar, Mudaliyar, with the support of the Naidus who were native to Tamil Nadu, the Kamma Naidus who were native to Tamil Nadu. So when the linguistic movement, when the split started happening, when the need began to be felt for Andhra Pradesh and coastal Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, etc., to move on and become independent states in their own right, the ideological core remained in Tamil Nadu, and the remainder, went away to the other states. And if you look at it, the center of Dravidian politics, Justice Party's politics and Dravidian politics, was Madras city, for the very simple reason that the presidency, the center of power in the presidency was the city of Madras. And therefore, all of the politics of the Justice Party centered around the city of Madras. In fact, in one of the governments, the early governments of Justice Party had a all Telugu cabinet. And there was a complaint among the Tamil-speaking parts of the Justice Party that there was too much participation from Telugus, and they needed some, representation from Tamils. And that's how I believe Sir Sivanyanam Pillai, the Saiva Pillai from the south, was included into the cabinet. If I'm not wrong, it was Sivanyanam Pillai who was included into the cabinet upon this demand. But when the linguistic expression started happening, and Madras state, the city of Madras remained with Madras state, the interest of the Telugu, heartland and the Odiyas in the politics of self-respect movement or the politics of DMK started waning. And they were, then it became something of a Tamil nativist movement. They took on the contours or the shape of a Tamil nativist movement. Even though to this day, a lot of the leaders of the Dravidian movement, a lot of the leaders are Telugus, or a lot of the leaders are actually Telugus. Vai Gopal Swami Naidu is a Telugu, Vaiko. There are many, there are at least 4 ministers in this current cabinet itself who are Telugus. There is also the persistent story that, that the ruling family, Mr. Karunanidhi's family themselves are, migrants from Andhra Pradesh from 10, 12 generations back. The family has neither, confirmed nor denied these claims, but there is a claim. So there is a there is a significant Telugu participation in the Dravidian movement all along. Then there has been all along, except that post-independence, and post the separation of Andhra Pradesh and the formation of linguistic states, true to their shape-shifting style, the Dravidian movement took on the, a linguistic nativist form.
Okay, so let's now move. Of course, we all know about Periyar, and we know about the Dravidian movement that took place post the 60s. Now, Periyar used two key phrases, if you want to call it that: Suyamariyadai and Samadharmam, that is self-respect and social justice. Now, did Tamil Nadu get social justice in terms of, Dalits specifically and other smaller castes, other backward castes? Did Dalits, do you think they actually benefited under the Dravidian movement as compared to the rest of the country?
See, Tamil Nadu state hasn't had a scheduled caste chief minister till date, right? If you look at the cabinet positions in any cabinet ministry, how many scheduled caste people have had positions outside of, scheduled caste welfare, women and Adi Dravida welfare? See, Satyavani Muthu was a very tall scheduled caste leader, right? She had women and Adi Dravida welfare. Even today, the same legacy continues. The scheduled caste representatives are in women and Adi Dravida welfare, or in maybe one or two positions in the cabinet. Key positions in the cabinet, finance, or the home is usually home ministry cabinet in Tamil Nadu is usually held by the chief minister himself or herself. The key positions are never given to scheduled caste. And if you look at a really powerful scheduled caste leader, it was PWD minister Kakkan in the Kamraj ministry in the Congress period, who held a very powerful position. In fact, if you look at it across India, if you look at any kind of nativist or regional party or a caste party, usually you won't find scheduled caste people holding key positions. You can take anything. I mean, see, in Andhra Pradesh, one of the earliest CMs, the first scheduled caste CM in India was in unified Andhra Pradesh state. After that, the CM position has usually shifted between a few castes. It has been between a Reddis, Kamas, maybe the odd Brahmin, right? And any TDP or a YSRCP ministry, how many key positions are held by scheduled caste people? Or for that matter, in Shiv Sena, how many scheduled caste people are in senior positions in Shiv Sena? Right? So my contention, what I'm driving at is, unless it's a nationalist pan-Indian movement, you cannot find space for scheduled caste leaders in the political firmament, and that's true for the DMK also. So that's about the political, political power and how much political power has been devolved to people from scheduled caste. In terms of reservations itself, in 1923, when the communal GO demand was raised, in 1920s, when the first communal GO demand was raised, the demand was for positions in the legislature, mainly in the legislative council and the legislative assembly, for Hindu, non-Brahmin Hindus, right? So MC Raja was one of the leaders who was part of the Justice Party, and he said that we would need a specific set of reservations in the legislature for depressed classes. The scheduled castes were at that time called the depressed classes. When the Justice Party refused to go by his demand, MC Raja actually left the Justice Party. Okay, so that is in terms of representation, right? The actual, in terms of actually getting reservations, scheduled caste reservations happened in the Madras state along with the rest of India when it was part of the when it was adopted in the Republic, right? So if you look at temple entry, right? Temple entry, there was no temple entry bill. 1947, under the leadership of Omandur Ramasamy Reddyar, a Congress leader, who was the CM, the premier at that time of Madras state, it was when the legislation for allowing entry for all Hindus of all castes into places of worship was passed. And even before that, the first state where it was passed was actually in Travancore, where Chitra Tirunal promulgated the entry of all communities into the temples, right? So temple entry, in fact, when the agitation for people of depressed classes and of certain other so-called untouchable classes, when the agitation for entry into Madurai temple was taken up by the Congress people, the people holding it back were the traditional Dharmakartas and the Dharmakartas of the Madurai Meenakshi Amman temple. So, who were also staunch supporters of the Justice Party, right? And if you take any of the atrocities, really serious atrocities against scheduled caste people in Tamil Nadu, whether it is Keelvanmani or whether it is the Manjolai, atrocity, or even the recent terrible events in Vengai Vayal, the perpetrators, the state has gone really soft on the perpetrators always, right? DMK or ADMK, right? I don't think the victims of Keelvanmani or Manjolai, any of these atrocities ever got real justice. And if you look at the number of cases filed or the number of convictions and cases filed under SC/ST Atrocities Act, Tamil Nadu is nowhere behind anywhere of the country. It's fairly leading the rest of the country in terms of SC/ST atrocities. And if you look at it, it's especially the Delta districts where the prevalence of SC/ST atrocities is way higher than in the rest of Tamil Nadu, right? If in popular imagination, you would have the dominant communities, the one-year Gounders and Tevars as the real, bigots who are responsible for a lot of the atrocities. But a lot of the atrocities, highest proportion of atrocities happen in the Delta district, where it is not these people who are the dominant landholding landlords, right? So, if you look at it, a lot of the what has it done for scheduled caste people? Okay, the lot of scheduled caste people has improved in TN along with the lot of everybody else, but still the gap between TN in scheduled caste and others is just as wide here in TN as in any place else in India. And in fact, the amount of caste discrimination against scheduled caste, I would say that it is fairly higher in the rural parts of Tamil Nadu as opposed to other places in the country.
Even today, when one travels to the rural areas, we see that there is a separate Dalit colony and there is a separate, dominant caste colony, other caste colony. So that's pretty indicative. It's there even today, and they do not live side by side in that sense. One Dalit studies expert told me that basically what the Dravidian movement accomplished was to create a new set of Brahmins, in a sense of a new set of castes, which became very powerful, but the problems of the scheduled caste continue to remain the same. So, so that's something you would agree with, I'm guessing.
See, the Dravidian movement, I wouldn't say it created Brahmins or anything. If anything, what it seeks to do is to remove the Brahmin of their characteristics, remove everybody of their characteristics, and go towards some kind of imaginary uniformity in how people should be. That's their stated aim. But what it has done to do, what it has managed to do, is to shore up the privileges of the numerically smaller upper caste people, right? Under the guise of social justice, under the guise of sharing power with everybody. Tamil Nadu's cabinet under the DMK has often been one of the most Savarna cabinets, Savarna dominated cabinets. If you look at the number of Mudaliars, Naidus, Chettiars, Pillais who form part of the cabinet, it's one of the most Savarna cabinets. In fact, the founding members of DMK, the Aimperum Talaivar, the 5 leaders, there was one Baliga Naidu, which is at the top of the caste hierarchy, and 4 Mudaliars, right? Annadurai, Nedunjazhiyan, Madiyalagan, N.V. Natarajan. These were the 4 upper caste Mudaliars, and one Balija Naidu, E.V.K. Sampath were the 5 big leaders of DMK when it was formed. So what it has done is shore up the privilege of the non-Brahmin upper caste people, co-opt some of the upwardly mobile segments of the middle castes. Upwardly mobile segments co-opt the Christian Nadars, co-opt some of the subgroups within the Mukulator community, co-opt some of the segments within the Konguvellalar community also. Konguvellalar community, actually they have made very few inroads into that community, the Dravidian movement. They have remained largely aligned with the ADMK, not with the DMK. and co-opt these people and shore up the privileges of the erstwhile upper class which formed during the colonial period. So that is what it has done. And if you look at it, I mean, if you look at the Dravidian movement, or if you look at the Indian communists, you look at the Politburo of the Communist Party of India and or the cabinet in Bengal, it would look like, as Ambedkar described it, he called them a bunch of Brahmin boys. And I think for a long time, till recent times, that description of the communists held true. And if you could call the Dravidian movement as the leadership of Chettiar, Mudalayar, Pillai, and Naidu people, Naidu men specifically, I think that description would hold true.
Very interesting. Let me ask you on another subject. How did the Dravidian, like we said, social justice was one of their main, calls to action in a sense. So how did the Dravidian movement emancipate or uplift women in Tamil Nadu?
See, as I said, look at the proportion of women holding senior positions anywhere in the Dravidian movement. Okay, so you had, the means of, managing this is, a lot of the smoke screen and mirror style of management, or managing a narrative, where they would have certain, icons, say, Muvalur Ramamridam Ammayar, or Annai Meenambal Sivarajan, this is Meenambal Sivarajan, or, Sulochana Sampath. These would be held up as, basically their icons of women empowerment. But actually, if you look at it, in the Dravidian parties, if it's, until the rise of Jayalalitha, in both ADMK, DMK, it was an all-male show. And, some of the self-respect movement, for example, the self-respect marriages is supposed to have emancipated women in some way. But one of the earliest self-respect marriages, which was presided over by Mr. E.V. Ramaswamy himself, was the marriage of it was not an intercaste marriage. It was a marriage of a Reddy gentleman, and it was consanguineous to cousins, and it was bigamous. Two girls, actually sisters, wanted to marry the same man, the same cousin. And so it was within the Reddy community, and it was self-respect marriage. So where is, women's emancipation in this self-respect marriage concept? It is all, again, show screen, smoke screen and mirrors. If you remove the tali, you are somehow emancipated. I don't see how that happens unless you get sufficient participation in the professions, unless you have participation in, political life. How does that happen? I don't see that happening. See, the Devdasi Abolition Act was actually passed only in 1947, along with the Temple Entry Act in Madras State, when Omandur Ramsamy Reddiyar was the CM in a Congress ministry. Earlier, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, when she was a nominated member of the Madras legislature in 1930, she had tried to pass the act. Okay. The nomination, she was given nomination by the Swaraj party. The Swarajists were a faction of the Congress who were then in government. So when the first attempt to pass the act in Madras state happened, it was 1930. The Congress was in power. It was not the Justice Party. And even then, the Justice Party promised support to Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy when she tabled the bill in the House. And later, it was defeated. The bill was defeated on technicalities. It couldn't be passed because of certain technicalities. But if you look at the history of Devdasi abolition, it had already happened in Mysore state in 1909. And 1929, Travancore and Cochin had already abolished the Devdasi system. 1934, Bombay Presidency abolished the Devdasi system, and 1947 is when it was finally abolished under a Congress government. So where was the Dravidian movement in this? And as a matter of fact, the leaders of the Dravidian movement were often people from the landed aristocracy who were patrons of the Devdasis, and they had Devdasi concubines themselves. In fact, one of the leaders of the Justice Party who later on moved to the Congress was R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar, and he had a very famous relationship. His relationship was with a very famous lady from the Devdasi community. So they had no interest in abolishing Devdasi system. So what was their contribution, the Dravidian movement's contribution to the whole thing is my question.
You made some very interesting points about smoke and mirrors, and this in how such ideas and ideologies had spread and become popular public perception. Now, my question to you is, today we live in a very information heavy age, yet we see everywhere on social media and with people whom we meet, who very, very easily and gullibly, buy into this entire, Dravidians are not, part of the Indians, or we are separate, or we are a different race concept. So what would you say? I mean, how would you say you can put an end to this, or change public perception in some way, show the truth mirror to them rather than having, smoke and mirrors? How do you say it can be done?
See, the technique that they have always adopted is, it's not never one person who says it. Okay, if you look at the history, every one of the senior leaders had their own magazine. See, Annadurai had, C.N. Annadurai had Dravida Nadu. Varadalajulu Naidu had Navasakti, if I'm not wrong. Kannadasan had his own magazine called Chandamarutam. I think Chandamarutam was Kannadasan's magazine. So all of these had small circulations. They were often run just at break-even level, but they continued running them, right? And they continued repeating them. It's a repetition from multiple sources. And the fact is, people, confirmation bias is a very big thing with human beings, right? Even now, there are a lot of people who believe that, Elvis is alive, right? People believe in UFO sightings. People believe that men never landed on the moon, right? And the moon landing, Apollo landings were all a hoax. People believe that MGR is going to, till recently, a lot of people believe that MGR is going to come back. People believe that Prabhakaran is not dead, right? People will believe anything, right? People are capable of believing anything as long as there is confirmation bias, right? So the core is a psychological play where they seed the fact that if anything that a Brahmin says has to be false, right? Because they have seeded a psychological fear of the Brahmin, and a psychological fear saying that the Brahmin finds refuge in the Hindu religion, the Brahmin finds refuge in the Indian state, the Brahmin finds refuge in the judiciary, and therefore all of these are, the Indian state, the judiciary, the Hindu religion, everything is loaded against the Dravidian, right? If you seed that idea at a psychological level, and then everything else you say will be accepted through confirmation bias, mainly through confirmation bias. For example, in France, we would all have heard of the Dreyfus affair, right? In which Jewish officer in the French army was actually underwent a trial by media and was eventually convicted of spying when he was innocent. Just through confirmation bias, because everybody in the press, the public, the judges on the bench, the jury, everybody was convinced that just because the man was Jew, he must have betrayed France, right? Because Jews are by nature, they are treacherous, right? Which had been seeded. And if you have that psychological belief, your confirmation bias will allow you to believe anything that feeds that confirmation bias.
I actually have two last questions, and because you've explained so much in so much detail, and it's just been a beautiful rendition of a vast chunk of history that I'm pretty sure none of the kids nowadays know about. My question to you is, so when going by your example of the Dreyfus, where people just believed that a Jew was capable of spying, did the Brahmin do something or ill-treat people or revile somebody, some caste, or harmed people for the entire Brahmin community to be treated in this fashion, with mistrust, with hatred in a sense?
See, if you look at take the parts of the Hindu Smriti corpus itself, you can blame the Europeans who translated. You can blame the Sutrakaras. but there are parts which are objectionable. Okay, you cannot just wish it away. There are parts of the sutris, the Smruti corpus, which are objectionable, and there are writings by the Sutrakaras which are definitely objectionable. Right? But how far was it practiced? Did it deliberately favor only the Brahmin in any way, or did it favor Dvijas in some way? And eventually, how practical were these recommendations in the Smrutis? At the end of the day, see, it is supposed to have privileged Dvijas, which is Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya. At no point in time in India would these three communities have accounted for more than 20% of the population, right? Even if you take only the agrarian population, because a good part of the population was the forest-dwelling tribes and the mountain tribes and the fishing tribes, who were out of the ambit of the Chaturvarna system. At no point in no place would these three communities have comprised more than 20-25% of the population. And the large population were of the Shudras, where people, the crafts were in their hand. The land was largely in the hands of Shudras. The music, a lot of the music was in the hands of Shudras. Music and dance and the art forms. So when all these levers of control of thought were in the hands of, were fairly distributed among different communities, where was the ability for just, maybe at no point in time would the Brahmin community have exceeded more than 5%, right? Maybe in pockets like in the 1930 census, Brahmins in the Tanjavur district were supposed to have been nearly 17-18% of the population. But outside of these pockets, over large stretches of land, the Brahmin community would not have been more than 5% at any given point in time, or space, or large stretch of land. So how could they have actually implemented these sutras, or this injunction, so-called injunction to pour molten lead in somebody's ear, or pour molten lead in somebody's mouth? Or is there any evidence for these, commands having been carried out at any given point in time? Is my question, right? I'm not saying that everything is unobjectionable. There is from the viewpoint of a modern person, there are parts of the Smriti, and I say this as a very religious Hindu. There are parts of the Smriti which are objectionable, cannot be taken as. But how much was it actually put in practice, and how much of real power to actually put in practice did the Brahmins exercise during the long years of our history? Was my question.
It's indeed it's a very, very fair question to ask. Of course, I don't think we will find easy answers. My last question to you, sir. As far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, this is one of it's sort of a leader in a sense in the country in terms of linguistic politics. How did the Dravidian movement fold into the Tamil movement?
See, the Tamil movement itself was if you take the history of the Tanit Tamil movement, was actually independent of the Dravidian movement. The leaders were people like Paridimar Kalaignar, and Maraimalai Adigal, who were proponents of who were actually, all of them were very religious Hindus, and they were proponents of a pure Tamil, which they felt had to be rescued from heavy influences of Sanskrit. Theirs was a linguistic movement and a partially born of religious zeal, that you needed to have the ability for Tamils to participate in a lot of participate and learn in their own language, and to have their own vocabulary for describing their own world, their own inner world, and so on. So Tanit Tamil movement was a movement basically to remove. It was a linguistic movement mainly, on the line of, the Turkification movement in Turkey. Post in the time of Ataturk, they wanted to remove Arabic influences. They said, yes, we are Muslim, but we have a unique language and a unique culture of our own, and the language is a part of this culture, and we want to remove Arabic influences. And the Tanit Tamil movement was something of that sort, the Turkic movement. But what the Dravidian movement did was it true to its shape-shifting capability, it absorbed this Tani Tamil movement and made it a race issue, where evil Brahmins would force their language upon you, and they then conflated. See, Sanskrit being a less influential language, they then conflated Hindi, the language, as the language of the colonial oppressor, which would take over, and therefore they were able to very successfully create this this emotional thing around the Tamil language, and themselves put themselves as the position themselves as the protectors of the Tamil language. When in fact, E.V. Ramaswamy, the first Hindi Prachar Sabha in Tamil Nadu, was started in Erode, if I'm not wrong, on premises donated by E.V. Ramaswamy when he was part of the Congress party. Later on, he participated in the anti-Hindi agitations of the 1930s. But later in life, when the DMK was riding the anti-Hindi agitation to power, E.V. Ramaswamy said that language is just a means of communication. And if you want to really, use language as a means of upward mobility, you better learn English. He said, speak in English to your wife, speak in English to the lady who cleans your house, and, learn English, for that is the language of science, and that is the language of upward mobility. And at a later point in time, he is said to have, he called the Tirukkular a pile of shit. I mean, but true to the Dravidian movement shape-shifting ability and the ability to, reconcile, total opposites. They take these total opposite words that E.V. Ramaswamy said, with their mantle, assuming of the mantle as protectors of Tamil, and at the same time, I don't know, they also run a lot of CBSE schools which teach Hindi, and very few of their second or third generation kids, their kids themselves actually are very good at Tamil. They can't speak Tamil fluently. Many of the second or third generation children of the Dravidian leaders themselves, or the Dravidian ideologues for that matter.
So that's absolutely amazing. It has been an amazing interaction, an eye-opener to myself, and no doubt to many, many others who are going to be listening to this podcast. Thank you very much, and I do hope that this will give some perspective to all, at least a lot of the younger generation who have pretty much grown up in a very different kind of circumstance that you or even I have grown up in. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your patience and for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thanks.